thanks everybody. Welcome. My name's Neil Howman from 202 Communications. We had a sustainability focused panel, I want to say 6 months ago, but it's actually, the way the year's gone, it's nearer to 8+ months ago. And we thought, because quite rightly, this topic has got somewhere near the top of the agenda in the streaming world, it would be a good time to revisit this topic. And who better to revisit it with than Dom Robinson, founder of Greening of Streaming and co-founder, director and creative fire starter of ideas.com. Thanks for joining us, Dom.
That's all right. Eric and I are trying to shorten that to CBDO of both, but we're not quite sure that's the right title yet. So,
well, CBD is getting a lot of press.
It's quite it might confuse things with Greening of Streaming, but anyway.
Well, I'm very grateful for your time because you know, you seem to be everywhere at the moment. I mean, in a good way.
Everywhere without leaving my seat, actually, which is quite good. So.
Amazing.
It's been one of the big changes from day job has been running a software company for a long time to sort of really focusing more or less full time on Greening and Streaming has been a pressure and an insistence not to travel. It feels like it fits with the ethos of what we're about to an extent, and so and most conferences have now sort of switched their thinking, so they do allow a hybrid or a virtual first strategy. So suddenly I'm all over the place without leaving my seat, which is great because I've worked online for 25 years, audio conferenced all the way through that. But every time I've actually done anything that sort of requires any interaction, got on a train or got on a plane, and that suddenly seems to be shifting, which is quite interesting.
I hope this platform is meeting with a certain amount of approval and helping you to sort of, influence the world one conference or online conference at a time. What I wanted to do, Dom, I've got quite a bit of ground to cover, but because we've got you here, I wondered if you could, I'm presuming most people who've joined us are aware of Greening of Streaming and the work that you do, but just in case there are people who are wanting to find out a bit more about you, could you just take a very brief time to maybe just give us a bit of an introduction, a bit of an overview about what you do and what you're trying to do, and then I've got maybe some follow-up questions about Greening of Streaming.
It's all right then, Neil. What I'll do, I've got a sort of a mind map that I use to introduce the whole topic, and actually it will help everybody have a big picture if I can share the right desktop. Let me share that up with you. Wonderful. Does that look okay?
That looks great. Certainly to me.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, sorry about the widescreen format, but it's just life. Right, let's see if we can. I'm going to skip a lot at the beginning. I've been in the streaming space since the mid-90s, written for the trade press, ran a lot of CDN conferences, and out of the CDN focused conferences, discussions started to emerge about sustainability about 3 years ago, and they really accelerated. So off the back of it, I wrote an article for Streaming Media called Greening of Streaming, like the name, registered the domain, and then thought it was a good idea to start a trade association off the back of it, or a members group. We're kind of a bit hybrid about the term we actually use to define ourselves. And then over several CDN conferences, we really gelled the idea for that and did an initial one-day event of our own towards the end of the pandemic last September, and invited membership. And the top 2 rows of that members list all joined up immediately as founder members. And obviously there's some fairly big names in there, which gave us quite a lot of lifeblood from the outset. So we got together in October last year, agreed main objectives was to actually make a real change through education and engineering. We offer a capability or a function to be an industry voice. Basically, at some point, the conversation was going to move from cryptocurrency mining as a bad thing for the environment to streaming because it's quite considerably more resource demanding, and at some point policymakers and the press were going to start asking questions, and it was most of the policy formation at the time was fairly nebulous. We can go into that in a minute, Neil, but that's one of the functions anyway. And we also agreed one main rule, which I think really makes us a club above everything, which is no greenwashing. Fortunately, no one's put that to the test yet, but essentially that's a blackballing offence. And if you get accused by your peers of greenwashing and can't stand the heat, then it may get put to a member's vote. Which was interesting. It was thrown in as a bit of a joke, and it's become the soul of the organisation, which is quite.
Yeah, and we'll certainly hopefully explore that a little bit later as well.
Definitely, and then yeah, it's fee based. We have quite a high entry fee. We didn't want people to be buying a green badge. We wanted people to jump through a hurdle to make quite a serious commitment to get involved with us, because we wanted to drive some working groups to really make a difference, as our sort of main objective outlines. So what are the activities we're up to? Well, we work in working groups. We're up to about 9 now, and we'll go through some of these in more detail later. But 1 to 3 were set up before we started. As I sort of brought the idea together, it felt like we needed one to look at language, terms and measures and get consistency across the industry. Another working group is to deal with the interface with people outside of the group. So membership growth, stakeholder engagements, that sort of thing, annual summit. And then we have a best practice group, which is the aim, if you like, of what we're trying to do, which is to develop and disseminate best practice amongst the engineering community who are building large streaming systems and so on. But at the moment, we don't know where the needles are. There's definitely no consensus on that, let alone how we move those. So it's a bit early for best practice. That group also forms our governance and oversight group. So they're sorting out how we operate and share IPR and stuff. Working group 4 is one I think we should go into in a bit, Neil. Okay. Working group 5 is very much specific around audio streaming projects. Working group 6 is another working group that I think we should dwell on. So working group 4, sorry, I sort of skipped over that. We're looking to do at-scale live event energy measurement, and I can go into a lot of depth about why that's important, but those projects are underway, and there's quite a lot of activity this week, but I'll say no more. Right. And then working group 6 is talking about the idea of what the lowest sort of minimum viable product in terms of energy is for delivery end-to-end, which is what we nickname our Good Enough working group, or our Gold Button project. So there's quite a lot to talk about in that. It involves much broader spread of people than just the engineers doing distribution in the internet. Right. Working group 7 is for the binary heads who want to talk technical protocols and help protocol developers in other groups consider energy as a KPI. Working group 8 is looking at specifically enterprise use of streaming, so that starts to more broadly focus on things like video conferencing and other streaming contexts, maybe even data streaming. And working group 9 is actually largely consists of non-members. They're academic liaison. So Adam, who has been our exec director for the last year, is now dominantly looking after working group 9. And that is fostering relationships with academic institutions, because there's a lot of them and they're climate experts. And one of the important things that I'll leave you with is we don't talk about carbon very much in greening of streaming. We talk about watts, and we are gathering wattage information and then liaising with climate scientists to try to interpret that in terms of carbon and in terms of environmental and sustainability impact. And one of the advantages of talking about watts alone is it also engages the finance community in this year's energy crisis. That's been a particularly strong extra element to what's been going on in greening and streaming.
We appreciate that very much indeed, Dom. So thanks very much indeed for that. Going back to the 2 working groups that you mentioned, events and energy and the compression decompression, are they because they are the most advanced working groups in that you've got most investment, most members? How do they come about? Is it what somebody comes to you with an idea and says, let's look at this? How does that work?
This is where the extra 20 minutes in the normal presentation happens. But so working group 4, actually what I'm going to do is go back to my screen share and go into a little bit more detail on something there. So if I go back 2 steps. I think we zoom into working group 4. That's probably too small for you.
It's a little small to see the.
Okay, that's not unusual. So here's one I prepared earlier. Okay, so this diagram I drew up as a bit of a thought piece to try to explain something that was troubling me in all of the data science that was trying to correlate streaming and its energy impact to climate science and so on.
Sure.
A lot of the methodology for working out how much impact an application has on a shared infrastructure like the internet. So this is a live stream, okay, and this is one of every box that needs to be plugged in order to get your live stream from your encoder, which could be your FaceTime camera, typically through some sort of digital asset management, switches, routers, up the amplifiers, which are stuck on the top of every telegraph pole or buried underground on the way to the cabinets and so on. So it's a reasonably detailed, logical schematic of what's happening, one of every system that you need to plug in to get a stream right the way through to the consumer's device. Now, what's been happening in a lot of the sort of evolution of the science around digital application and its energy impacts is you start with the devices which are only really using the energy. That's it, nice and easy, set-top box, mobile phone, you can kind of measure that reasonably straightforwardly, and you can attribute 100% of the data and it's streaming to the TV because that's what its function is. That's a nice, easy sort of measurable thing. But once you take a step back and you look at the router in the corner of the room, then you need to somehow work out how to attribute the energy that router's using to the service. And in simple terms, and I'm going to use round numbers to make it simple, what's been happening is you take a 100-watt router with 100 megabits of throughput and 10 megabits of Netflix, Disney, whoever it may be, passing through the router. And so you attribute 10 watts, 10% of the capacity, you attribute 10 watts to the Netflix service or whatever it is for the duration of the playback. And you do that through the system. And obviously, how many people can share that infrastructure, sort of helps you divide the energy by the potential of the users. But the problem is that the logic goes then that if you halve your bandwidth, then you're using 5 megabits, and so you attribute 5 watts. And so there's been a very compression-led focus to how we make streaming more sustainable. Which is good because compression has reduced cost as well, and so compression has been very aligned with its purpose has been very aligned with minimizing impacts and maximizing efficiency. But obviously, in that model, it doesn't really matter what you do to the compression; the router's still actually burning 100 watts. And this point seems to have slipped out of consciousness because actually this whole infrastructure is all on all the time and typically provisioned not only for max but for double max because of redundancy. So it's massively over provisioned even before the streaming starts. So when I was reading a lot of correlations between gigabytes and carbon, it started to trouble me because no gigabytes still equals a whole hell of a lot of carbon. In fact, it equals all of that infrastructure. Many kilowatts, many megawatts of infrastructure before you send a packet.
Yeah, Dom, can I just interject, because obviously we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I'm sure people will, to dig deeper into the working groups, then please, everybody who's joined us today, please take the opportunity to connect with Dom and can dig deeper into this. But you participated in an IBC panel a few monmonths ago. It was entitled "Sustainability in Media: Is it real or just a thing?" Catchy title. And you had a couple of comments about we haven't worked out how to measure, or we haven't got a sort of common framework of language for measuring. Does this go to the heart of that?
Yes, exactly.
Or concept of what to focus on?
Exactly. So working group 4, that network diagram, I put it up in front of a bunch of people who develop streaming infrastructure. A lot of them had never thought of it so systemically before. And I put the challenge to them that in going from 0 to 30 million viewers and back to 0 again on their live streaming infrastructures, they'd struggle to measure an energy fluctuation.
Yeah. So are we getting any?
And so we've got two issues there. The question is not just measurement, but the question is what to measure, and so on. And so looking at the infrastructure as a series of boxes that you've got to power, you then start to isolate the problem. And essentially our members have ownership or influence or control of these types of devices and these infrastructures. So we've set about instrumenting them so that we can measure their wattage around the applications that are actually using them, which are large streams.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do is create that measurement, and from that point we can actually start talking sensibly. But at this point, the infrastructure owners themselves haven't measured it, and there's an awful lot of outside observers who are conjecturing an awful lot, but who haven't actually measured it. And so there is a real discrepancy in understanding how the two things work. And when you so what we're doing is making sure that we can actually bring some data, surface some data that actually has meaning that we can actually react to as engineers.
So maybe we'll return to that and the sort of bigger picture and looking a little bit further ahead. I did want to, and I'm sure some of our guests here would have some further questions, and please feel free to follow up with Dom after this conversation in future to see how you can possibly get involved in some of the working groups and to maybe drill down into some of the finer details. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things from your slides, Dom, about the engagement with policymakers. When I was getting ready for this conversation, something occurred to me that I know that you had a very good event at the UK Parliament earlier this year, and you got engagement from both the governing party and the opposition party, and all well and good. Suffice to say, and I'm sure many of our guests understand this, that the political landscape in the UK, at least, is somewhat turbulent. And my concern with this is where there is a lot of goodwill demonstrated. And I know equally the EBU, who are a Green Streaming member, have been doing great work in Europe, and you liaise very closely with them, and indeed the European Parliament. But how serious is government, really? How serious would you say they are about, because we need legislation to help in this work?
I'm trying to work out how to answer that without politicizing the answer.
Have a go.
Universally, everyone can do more. There is no one person who's doing enough. There's no one person out there who can say the job is done, we've completed it, we've solved sustainability, and we've solved impact. So until we're at that point, we're not done. So any politician who's resting on any laurels for supporting us hasn't done enough. All they've done is welcomed us to the table and made people aware that we're there. From our point of view, we are not at a point in the UK where policy is being made specific to this area. There is some great work being done in Ofcom at the moment, which they've been driving across groups like the DTG, the EBU have had interaction with that, and so on and so forth. They have been looking at overall energy demand for telco infrastructure, for broadcast infrastructure, and so on, which is, in my mind, the right place to start. They have been comparing traditional broadcast energy footprint with streaming. I think they were slightly worried that we were going to come up and saying it's all solved, it's all green. It's not. You know, in certain circumstances, traditional broadcast is far more efficient than streaming. In other circumstances, streaming is much more efficient at delivering what users particularly want to watch. So there's horses for courses. But that all said, there isn't a particular stride out in the UK at the moment to make any policy around our space, which is good and fine. And the industry needs to get to a position where it can even talk about its problems before it can actually make changes. So it's good that there isn't policy coming down the line, and we're kind of in a good position to hear if and you know, the tree should shake our way now, having established ourselves in Parliament last year, if there is policy to make. And the fact that Ofcom have started liaison with us and others like that have started liaison with us, which is what we're all about, we should hear. So not the right time here. EU is much more active. The EU is far ahead of everyone else in terms of its policy making. The EU as a community think much more environmentally, and all their companies, led by the Nordics in particular, as well. They are serious about their sustainability. They're trying to do stuff. Some of the actions, in my personal opinion, are a bit knee-jerk and are coming from uninformed policy advisors.
Right.
The big five consultancies are doing a round at the moment. Certainly, I don't know how much this is in the public policy space, but certainly in corporate policy, they're selling seven-figure strategies which are coming up with utter nonsense in terms of data, data and green strategy, which just don't make any sense if you talk to an engineer. But they'll cost you a lot of money and sound good. Therefore, there's some liabilities being passed, but it is nonsense. So I think the political landscape in Europe is at least moving and testing the water and getting the discussions going. America's gone a bit funny. America's corporate strategy, I think, is moving faster than public policy in America.
I wanted to pay tribute to, I actually saw a panel at SIMTI in LA a few weeks ago, hosted by Barbara Lang, who's former panelist here, and our last conversation about it. There was an acknowledgement there that Europe is much further ahead, but it seemed good that the conversation was, gaining some traction. It was a well-attended panel, and we have to hope that it is, they're going to get in sync and move
definitely
much further forward. I think the comment about the big five, and we know who they are, the usual suspects coming in, and does that feed into the no greenwashing? Is that part of the problem in some ways, that you get a muddying of the waters on the whole greenwashing?
We're swimming. See, going back to that point I was talking about in the working group 4 situation. Policy is being formed on bad science, or bad is too strong a word. Policy is being formed on science which is incomplete and hadn't spoken to the industry about how it actually worked itself. So there's an awful lot of conjecture about how the internet works and how streaming is delivered. They've never spoken to the industry. The industry itself has only woken up to this issue 2 years ago. And so that's the crux of the issue.
You preempted essentially the question, because of course no greenwashing, as you said in your slides, and writ large at the bottom of your website, is the sort of core founding principle. I was just going to ask you how that's going in your view. You can both take it from an industry perspective. Are you seeing companies from behaving better, or
we saw what I would argue is quite a radical change in the marketing of streaming companies who got involved with greening of streaming as they joined us. There was some really significant steps. First of all, everybody was competing with their marketing before they joined us. Everybody was going to be the most sustainable, which when you challenge that question and ask it properly, you can't be the most sustainable. Nobody can win sustainability. If you actually understand your sustainability strategy, you have to start sharing it to your competitors. It should have something of an open source philosophy, and indeed we have an open source central IPR license between our members, because it's not something you can lock down and win, and we strongly believe that. So a lot of the members stopped feeling obliged to compete. They started talking about systemic working together collaboratively, but end to end, to really understand that you're not just moving energy problems down a supply chain, you're actually solving them. And so we saw all our members go, I can still talk about doing something, but the doing is actually really participating with people through greening and streaming, and that's the marketing at the moment, rather than we're trying to do some hair splitting stuff, which actually is probably, if you take it into a different context, invalid. And so everybody's gone back to the drawing board a little bit with their marketing strategy. One of the great things we had happen, we have internal sort of presentations between members, and one of our members stood up and basically went, "This is our new sustainability marketing. I want to put it in front of you because essentially you're my direct competitors. and I want the peer review from people who understand what I do. And that was basically a spark moment for me. That was when the no greenwashing mantra in the organization moved from being something that we must try to adhere to something that was really happening in terms of peer review, people actually accepting constructive criticism, going, are you really sure you can say that? How about this consideration? Oh yeah.
Just to play devil's advocate slightly on that, and that's obviously laudable progress and absolutely the direction of travel, but to an extent, and you mentioned earlier your members, you haven't had to call anybody out for this practice.
No, not yet. I'd actually would probably rely on another member to call it out rather than go looking. We don't want to become a police.
No, I totally get that. I think my point was people who haven't yet engaged fully with this, and in my everyday life, you talk to people and you go, well, yes, it's important to us. They pay lip service to it, but it's not somewhere near the top of their agenda. And frankly, it needs to be just from a planetary point of view rather than anything else. I wondered if there's a sort of sense of a bit of a preaching to the converted within your members. And as I say, just the devil's advocate question.
No.
Well, outside of the organization who you really need to be reaching and actually calling to account. I know there's only so much you can do, but
we should, I agree. We've gone for the jugular in a lot of ways, but with some members that I'm not going to announce today, but members which we're anticipating to join very shortly. We'll have 70% of internet traffic. On some peak times, we're going to have huge swathes of internet traffic, certainly in North America, Northern Europe, represented through our membership. So we've gone for a bit of a jugular in terms of let most people who are involved in the streaming ecosystem hang off some central providers, and those central providers are quite big and quite influential. They, and actually, I think of all of our longest running and most active members, I think, Atom, Broadpeak, Cortex, Mainstreaming, and Akamai, and I have to shout extra loud for Akamai. They were very much at the instigation of this. There's very few streaming service providers who are serious who don't use an Akamai plus CDN strategy. So we can get a lot of message out through Akamai, and a lot of people are carried by Akamai, and they have the intention to do the best they can, in as much as if they can make their entire environment more clean and green and more efficient, they are at this point very willing to share that strategy with some of their direct competitors in the name of sustainability. And I think that's one of the most exciting things in greening and streaming, is seeing these direct competitors put their swords away, sit across the table and go, actually, we know each other really well. We know exactly what we do. How can we both come up with a strategy to do this better? And that's really cool.
Wonderful. Again, to our guests, please have a think about some of your questions. I've just got I really appreciate your time, Tom, and we're trying to get through a number of points, and we can only kind of touch the surface on a few key ones. I wanted to just open this out slightly, referring back to that IBC panel that you participated on. I'm very keen to find out, in your opinion, where the most progress or the most notable developments have been made, say, over the past year or so. You talked about some difficulties of finding the common framework of language and the measurement, and what are we meant to be measuring, and how do we get to that point? You also mentioned, I think, in your Greening and Streaming Summit just before IBC, about the whole collaboration idea and the deduplication of skills. So it's not incumbent on one particular company to be doing that. And it's all about the interaction. And I'm certainly seeing more notifications of that. But I was just going to ask you where you think the most notable developments have been, in what sort of areas.
So I think people, there was an initial run out of the starting gates at the end. Certainly COP26 seemed to kick off quite a lot of discussion.
Sure.
And there was a run out of the starting gates with people coming up with ESG, blue sky ESG strategies and so on. And in the streaming space, some of them were just nonsensical and were ill considered and so on. And so over this year, there's been a tempering of a lot of those early sort of misdirected but hot-wired ideas. Now, I don't like dissing them. I think even a greenwashing strategy is typically nobly intended. Actually, I don't think many people really go out with a green paintbrush to try to paint over their pollution and go, oh, look, it's all right. I think what happens is people just get some data wrong or understand their own business and how it interoperates with other things wrong. So I think what I've seen over this year is people slowed down a little bit and thought, what can we really do? And over this year, engaging with lots of candidate members and lots of members, companies are all over the place doing some really serious work, but they are all university trying to get their measurements in place so that they can actually account for what they're doing and not account in a RECs and PPAs and offsets way, but actually say, look, we were using this many watts and doing this much traffic. Now we're using fewer watts and we're doing more traffic. And actually, as a whole, the biggest sort of challenge that we're working on really over the next 6 months is that the fabric of the internet, the routers and the wires and the data centers, those folks have actually been thinking quite hard about sustainability for a decade, if not more. And we've been interacting particularly with a couple of groups who are very well-founded, large member organizations, really focused on air conditioning, cooling in data centers and the growth of data centers and power and all of those issues around data centers, which is really the beating heart of certainly the long tail storage and the high capacity transcoding and so on. But the telcos have not been forthcoming and getting into the conversation. They've just been going, we ticked our boxes, we handle the capacity and we're as green as we can be. What's moving is, until now, they've just all met the demand. They haven't spoken to where the demand is coming from. So as streaming has become the tail that's wagging the dog, suddenly 70% of all the traffic is streaming. And suddenly that conversation is interesting, because the architects in streaming honestly just went, I don't care, the finance director pays for the electrons. We're desperately trying to get adoption and enter this new market as a competitor to broadcast. And so OTT has only just met the point where price and performance are acceptable. It's only now that we can review and start working on power as the kind of key KPI for design and architecture. And so we're not, up until now, we've just drunk from an ever-filling bowl of the fabric. But now we can actually start thinking about how we can be thrifty and thirsty and architect those systems differently. And that's what the architects are doing.
Right. Just a couple of questions that have come out of that. And again, slightly devil's advocate hat on. I want to talk to you about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Now, just for the benefit of everyone here, I'm sure most of you know, but scope 1 and 2 are essentially emissions that are either owned or controlled by a company, whereas the scope 3 emissions are consequences of the activity all the way down the supply chain, which may not be directly attributed to a company or organization. But when I pick up on, say, Barbara's comments during the same panel at IBC, where it's saying it's estimated that scope 3 emissions as such could be on average 5.5 times more than scope 1 and 2. The question, I suppose, Dom, is what is realistic for the streaming industry to achieve? Is scope 3 always going to be out of reach as far as quantifying, as far as having some responsibility for?
So
where are we?
I spoke after the BBC conference beginning of the summer, straight after the BBC, and they'd given us a big high level view of their sustainability sort of review, and they'd sort of pinned 82% of their emissions over into scope 3, and they were really getting hands-on with scope 1 and 2, their production and their directly influenced sort of energy demands and so on. And I came on and I essentially put my hand up and said, hi, we're your scope 3. And that's the sort of hidden infrastructure of all of this delivery stuff. We have a culture in greening and streaming that we can't pass the buck. We have to own the problem and to try to change that. So there is no scope 3 as far as we can possibly make it. You know, it's all our problem. We drive the demand for the air cons in the data centers. Sure. We can't just go, that's something.
And what do they say? What do they say when you say that? Because I mean, I'm maybe taking a slightly, you know.
So the broadcasters find it quite difficult because a lot of the broadcasters have just committed to their net zero strategies, and to an extent, a lot of that has been moving stuff into scope 3. And so by moving it down into scope 3, they can go, hi, we're net zero, and they've moved the problem. And by putting our hand up and saying, hi, we're your scope 3, we're saying the buck stops here, and we're going to take ownership. If you don't want to, fine, but we're at this level, we're taking ownership of it. It does make it a little bit harder for organisations that have already claimed net zero to get involved with greening and streaming.
One more scope 3 question.
Because just to finish that, it makes them harder to get involved with greening and streaming because to an extent they have to until it's measured, until we know what's going on. They have to reclaim the carbon, and so that's a challenge when you've already declared net zero.
Absolutely, and just on the scope 3, just a follow up, and forgive my ignorance on this, but do you include the consumer in scope 3 and all the emissions they're emitting? Right, because I just was reading a CSI magazine article literally a week ago. TV energy usage set to rise as consumers upgrade to 4K HDR. So they talk, getting back to your terawatt hours figures earlier, it's currently, I mean, it's frightening figures, 328 terawatt hours of electricity, 71 gigatons of CO2 emissions. That's for now. And with the upgrade to 4K HDR by 2026, they think that might have gone up to 345 terawatt hours.
So here we have the absolute danger. Here we have the absolute danger of the problem with producing stats when we don't really know what we're doing. Yeah. I don't know a TV manufacturer that can really give us that sort of systemic view of all their TVs running, let alone all the different manufacturers. So it's highly estimated. It's going to be panel derived. It's going to be very finger in the air, and I can accept that. And it's probably come from Cambridge mathematicians who are working from
just
McKinsey.
To clarify who it is, it's a Future Source Consulting and Interdigital report.
Okay, yeah. I read that 27-page report, and there was a lot of data in there, put it like that. And you know, the only data as an industry, we're in a position to realistically kind of share is 3% of world energy is being used by ICT. That's if you look at the UK, add together Virgin, BT, and you can that's a good 3 terawatts of 100 or whatever it is. You know, there seems to be consistency in this 3% of world energy. And there's a fairly consistent feeling that 70 to 80% of traffic, of network traffic, is video now. So, so you can put your finger in the air and go somewhere between 1% and 2% of world energy might be streaming. That's the figure. That's the only figure, and with that much rationale that you can put out there at the moment, because you can't measure it. We can't measure it. We can't tell you how much energy these big telcos are deploying specifically around specific streaming infrastructures. You have to take 100% of it.
I guess that
and own it and reduce it.
I'm sorry to rush you, Dom. I just want people to be able to have the opportunity to ask you questions before you run off to the cinema. Important engagement.
That's fine. We've got an hour. We've got 45 minutes.
It's time scale. Okay. From my perspective, time surely is of the essence. Following COP26, COP27, just from a planetary point of view, we're running out of time. So it's obviously not completely incumbent on you and the industry itself to solve this problem. But I'm just wondering what will sustainability best practice start to look like in the short to mid-term future? When are we going to get something tangible, or when are we going to get towards some sort of standards which everybody can kind of agree on? I mean,
there's a huge amount of work going across every industry vertical. It has the blessing that the energy crisis is causing everyone to focus on energy as a cost-saving measure. So it's extremely accelerated at the moment. And in fact, you know, sometimes we're sitting there going, actually, I'm not sure we can optimize anymore. You know, because things are cost optimized and nobody wants to waste money. And that means that it's becoming the cheaper alternative to be cheap, low energy and green. You know, those are the two boxes that people are sort of feeling like they can tick at the moment. We have to undo a few things in our thinking in order to really make a difference. All the offsetting is starting to get confusing. You can buy 100% renewable power from a data center that's diesel powered because of RECs and offsetting, and that upsets me, and that's deceiving people, and that's pure greenwashing stuff. And until we really stop the greenwashing, we can't really start to bring things down, because you're just gaming stuff. You're not really doing anything practical. I think, you know, in terms of timescale, we are already seeing groups like Orange and even the IEA are showing that traffic is growing significantly faster than energy demand. So we are winning. In some ways, we're winning, which is really exciting. But it doesn't mean we can just become frivolous with energy. We have a strong mantra within greening and streaming to be good energy citizens. So a lot of infrastructure side, so ISP, telco, they go, we're 100% green powered. RECs and offsetting maybe, but maybe they're hydro, I don't know. And that's it. So do we just keep abundantly using it? Well, no, I want some of that energy to be left to heat my mum's house affordably. You know, we've got a corporate social responsibility to do the right thing anyway. And engineers like a challenge. Reduce energy. Yes, make it green as well, but don't just assume because it's green you can be inefficient. Reduce energy, and that's a nice application design mantra. You know, it's very much what our working group 6 is looking for. It's looking for that lowest common denominator where you can deliver the day-to-day passive viewing to the 80-90% of the viewing audience at peak energy efficiency, but still provide a gold button option, so that if people want to opt into 8K UHD HDR 120 frames a second, you know, 444 depth on their massive screen with 300 people in their front room watching it, you can have that consumer choice. We are, after all, the streaming industry, and it's the internet. But we're not going to, at the moment, there is a tendency to deliver that by default. And that's probably the second soft target in terms of streamline efficiency. It's early to really tell that. We haven't validated that, but everyone we've spoken to sort of seems to share the mindset that actually over-engineering is largely going to be sort of the soft underbelly where we can really make a difference.
So the consumer can still have that choice, or they should be?
It's the internet, baby. It's the internet. You can have anything. Yeah, absolutely.
Give you an opportunity to say it instead of don't go to 4K. You good enough for other things. I mean,
it's the TVs on in the background of the kitchen, or the 30 TVs going down the escalators. At the moment, streaming has a habit of going for the top level on the adaptive bit rates. It has a habit of hunting for 4K, hunting for the deepest. And actually, most of us aren't even watching the damn thing. So why don't you just default to 1080p with know that you've got a DSP? I can go into the acronyms here, but why don't you just default to that? And start there as the most energy efficient and the lowest latency, fastest switching. But if you want 4K, you might have to opt in, wait 4 seconds for it to start. Okay, that's you know, that's not going to make a difference when you're watching Lord of the Rings. Yeah, sporting events, different considerations, but we're not looking at that at the moment. We're just looking at, can I deliver you 16K on a 16K TV screen that doesn't care how much energy it draws, it's just bigger than the neighbours. And we need to grow out of that as a society.